Welcome, everybody. My name is Jaime Stief. I work with the Tamarack Institute. Today, you are here for the webinar titled Connected Community, Discovering the Health, Wealth, and Power of Neighborhoods with Cormac Russel and John McKnight, as well as my esteemed colleague, Heather Keam. As we get started, we'd like to just acknowledge the traditional territories that we're joining from. I am joining from the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, colonially known as Waterloo, Ontario. The reason that we're doing this and sharing this, this is an act of truth, and the reconciliation is the step that comes after. So by first acknowledging the lands that we are on, we're deepening our knowledge and our understanding of the lands of our neighborhoods, who our neighbors are, the knowledges that they bring to the table. And with that, I am going to hand the mic over to my colleague, Heather Keam.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm so excited to be talking about connecting our communities. My name is Heather Keam, and I'm the Associate Director of the Deepening Community Team here at Tamarack. And I wanted to say that my office is located on the Haldimand Track, land promised to the Haudenosaunee people of the Six Nations, which includes 6 miles on the either side of the Grand River, and it is an absolute beautiful place and privilege to live here. I also wanted to do a shout out. We have 15 students who are joining us from Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, Canada. And welcome to all the students here to learn with us. And speaking of people on the call, as I went through the list, we are truly an international group. We have people from Canada, coast to coast, the US, the UK, Ireland, Estonia, New Zealand, Australia, Afghanistan, Cameroon, Finland, Italy, India. This is the beauty about being online, is that we have never been so connected from around the world. So welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good night, however, whatever time zone you're in. Today is a fireside chat, and I'm really excited to be joined by Cormac Russel and John McKnight, which I actually call dear friends. We've been on a long journey together in my time with Tamarack and Deepening Community. And I was really excited for the release of their book, Rediscovering the Functions of Our Community, of the Connected Community, Discovering the Health and Wealth and Power of Our Neighborhoods. I call it Rediscovering the Function of Our Community. And people are feeling so disconnected and lonely, especially somebody called it a COVID hangover. We have a COVID hangover. 2.5 years of being isolated. We are lonelier and disconnected than ever. The more divided polarization that's happening in our communities. And this book could not have been written at a better time, John and Cormac. So don't worry if you haven't read the book, because I have. And as you can see, I've got notes and I've got highlights, and I am hoping that this fireside chat will bring out some of those key elements of the book. And then we will tell you and send a link in the chat of where you can get it, because I'm pretty sure after our conversation, you're going to want to go out and do the same thing and mark it all up with notes. So I'd like to introduce John McKnight, who is the founder and co-director of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute. For 3 decades, John has researched social services delivery systems, health policies, community organizations, and neighborhood policy. He is the author of Careless Society and co-author of Building Communities from the Inside Out and The Abundant Community. And now we can add the Connected Community onto that list. Cormac Russel is the managing director of I always say nutritional because I used to be in health, Nurture Development, a faculty member of the ABCD Institute, and an internationally renowned thought leader, trainer, and speaker, and author, most recently of the Rekindling Your Democracy. If you haven't read that, that is definitely a must read on your list. And now we're going to add this to Cormac's list of books. And they both have websites. Jamie will put the websites in there for you to dive deeper into John McKnight's work and Cormac Russell's work. But I want to get started into the chat. And so my first question for you both is that you both have been doing asset-based community development, or we're going to say ABCD, for a long time. Why now? Why did you decide to get together and write this book?
We may have
John, do you want?
yeah.
Go ahead.
We may have different reasons why we decided to do that. On my part, at the beginning of ABCD, we published a guidebook to an asset-based approach to neighborhoods, and it was called Building Communities from the Inside Out, a path toward discovering the assets in your neighborhood. And that was published 30 years ago. And it is, I think we've sold some 120,000 of them, given away 20 or 25,000. And as a result of the 30 years that has taken place since that publication, which is a guide to using assets in a neighborhood, in the 30 years since then, we've learned a lot. We've gotten a lot of feedback. We've had a lot of new experiences. And so on my part, I felt that we had learned enough as a result of what people did as a result of the Green Book, that there was a next phase that needed to emerge, that we around what we have learned in that 30-year period. And that's how I see this particular book. It is the evolution, the next step in understanding community building from an asset approach. Cormac, you may have some completely different reasons.
Yeah, well, it's just to build on that, really, because it may be interesting, Heather, for people to know a little bit of what was going on a couple of years ago when we decided to write the book. So I think exactly as John says, you know, there was that sense of we were coming in from the field, in from the harvest. A lockdown was coming. Nobody really knew, I think, in March and April of 2020 what was going to happen. This was all new territory. We were being invited into an extended sabbatical. And John and I, just at a very practical level, were thinking, what might we do to be useful? And we assumed actually that we would be quiet and that we would use the time to write up our field notes and you know, just use the opportunity to feature the great stuff that we've been encountering around the world, because we were grounded like everybody else around the world effectively in terms of going to different places. Two things happened. One was we got to write the book, which is very much a book written for doers. So we agreed we'd try to write a book that was very much really grounded in, like you said yourself, Heather, yeah, what do we do on Monday morning? And that's very much, we're sharing stories of what we've learned at the feet of citizens around the world. But I suppose the second thing that happened is we got busier than ever. So we had to find ways of spending our lives on Zoom after Zoom after Zoom over the last 2 years, which was wonderful. But also then just the discipline of writing the book has been fascinating, because the challenge that we gave each other and the challenge that Berit Kohler, our publisher, gave us, we had this wonderful, wonderful editor, Steve Parenti, who just was fantastically, you know, courageous in saying, whatever you write, whatever we publish, it must be really, really accessible and clear and very, very straightforward, so that everybody and anybody could pick this up and go, I know what I need to do to get organized at a neighborhood level. So that's been a great adventure over the 2 years, but that's a little bit of the backstory, if you like, in terms of COVID.
Mm-hmm. And at the back of the book, there's a resource guide, and when you talk about making it tangible, the We Can game, I loved, and it's something that is adaptable. And so the book isn't just a good read. It's a bookmark ideas and thoughts and suggestions, and what can you do today, tomorrow, next week, next month, and probably and actually when you put the book together, it's like, what can we do over the year to do that? So it is a good read. So taking on thinking about the COVID hangover, as I talked about, and COVID, there's a lot of research out now, and it's not surprising because disconnection and loneliness was on the rise pre-COVID, and it just makes sense when you add a plus sign in there that we're going to get worse. And so we're really realizing that we're disconnected as a society. We're disconnected from each other. We don't know our neighbors. We're disconnected from our communities. The lack of civic involvement and just getting involved, volunteerism, voting, just caring for our neighbors, and then the disconnection from our issues and problems. This is something that I have really been thinking about. Is others will fix us. Others will fix the problem, and so we're disconnected as a society. Thinking about the research and the work that you both have been doing, what needs to change from us to go from disconnection to, as you say in the book, the connected community, and create the Ubuntu? I am because we are.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
John,
so
why don't you get us started?
Yeah.
Well, I think the book is divided basically into 3 sections, but conceptually it's 2. And one says, what are the building blocks that you can use to begin to connect? And the second is, what are the purposes, the functions that these building blocks can perform? And within that book, for those of you who are asking the question, what should I do? There are exercises that can be made manifest in each of the 3 basic sections. You might want to say something about that, Cormac.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the way we really wanted to communicate with folks who were living at local level, trying to figure things out around the practical question of how do I connect with my neighbors, was to say that you could really start by, in the first instance, discovery. So that's the first step, so we say there's something about putting on a new pair of glasses and recognizing that even though society can be a little bit like a meat grinder that pulls us into the marketplace, pulls us into working harder, pulls us away from those kinds of relationships that we're inviting people to take seriously. So the discovery phase is really about saying, let's try on a new pair of glasses. If you were able to stand on your street corner, or if you live in a house, stand outside your front door, and you were able to have a magic pair of spectacles that allow you discover things that tend to be invisible or made maybe not very valued because of the values of modern life, which promote disconnection, right? They promote, it's the rugged individual, it's the Frank Sinatra song, I did it my way, okay? And what we're singing is we're at least singing a different tune. I think John can hold a tune better than I can. We'll see how the fireside chat goes. Maybe if you've got a whiskey there, we might give it a try. But the Ubuntu tune says, like you say, I am because we are. But you got to discover that. And that starts with, like John says, recognizing there's an abundance of building blocks to a good life right where we live and a couple of door knocks away. But most of us live in a world where that story is not the dominant story. So somehow, as well as putting on a new pair of spectacles, you got to discover and listen with new ears. So the first 3 chapters really are all about a different perspective, standing at your block corner and seeing all of the gifts that you can't see in neighbors because they've been rendered strangers. These days, so many of our neighbors, we know in what I call head nodding terms. You know, we nod our head maybe when we're getting in the car. So beginning to recognize, at least in principle, that our neighbors are people who have contributions, who have gifts, who have knowledge, skills, talents, passions, which are, at least in potential, there as a treasure. Recognizing, like, there's so many clubs and groups and associations in my own neighborhood I will never be invited into. No, there's no one person who can know all of these clubs, groups, and associations, but they're there. So this very first few chapters is saying, let's just get really rooted in our local places, and let's be curious and make visible the invisible. That's all well and good, but then the question you asked, Heather, is how do you, once you've discovered these things, because you got to discover a little motivation too, by the way. One of the things that by March or April of 2020, I think was pretty apparent to me was that it's a pretty good idea to get to know your neighbors before you need them.
Yeah.
Before there's a lockdown, right? So, but we've got to discover, why neighborhood for us? Why neighboring up for us? A lot of people say that to me, you know, I don't think I'm really all that interested in knowing my neighbors. Why would I want to? So there's a lot of discovery, but once you begin the process of making sense, boy, it's a good idea, and what's available and waiting to be discovered, I think then the next stage is to begin the process of how do we bring those possibilities into relationship. If I love music and I like playing, you know, a violin, and I spend 3 hours every Thursday night getting in my car and driving to the other side of the city to play with somebody else who's got an affinity for a violin, it might be really interesting to discover just on my block, there's an entire orchestra that doesn't know each other, right? Why is that? Because they're just all really isolate, you know, solitude oriented kind of people, boring, you know, maybe, but maybe it's just because they've never been connected. And actually, what we say in chapter 6, I think, is that in fact, they're waiting. There's a whole chapter dedicated to saying the simple insights is very important, because I think a lot of people think, you know, especially if they're watching, you know, the news or reading the newspapers, they may think the world is really not a very welcoming place. But actually, people in our experience are waiting to be asked. They're waiting to be invited to join, to connect. So a big piece is, once you discover that there's an abundance of gifts and possibilities, a real genius of the place, of the people, of the economies, of the culture, and it's all there, my goodness, right under our nose. Now the question is, how do we bring that into fruitful relationship? And that's where the risk comes in, because that's about going out and having a conversation. And it doesn't have to be all that big. I mean, people listening would say, it could start with 1 or 2 conversations. You know, start with 2 or 3 neighbors. You don't have to go out and organize your entire neighborhood. But that connection, it's a modest but important step in the direction of moving from disconnection to connection. There's lots of other things we could say, but then the question is, now we're connected, what are we going to do together? So that's the third section of the book, called Mobilization. It's wonderful to know there's great things in the neighborhood and great people. It's wonderful to know that some of them are in relationship. It's even more inspiring to know that together we can create a culture that will allow us to do things that are absolutely centrally important to our well-being, to our democratic well-being, to our safety, to how we raise our children, to how we have in-season, nutritious, affordable food, you know. So it shows then that by moving from disconnection to connection, we can have a very, very buoyant, abundant life with our neighbours, which is much, much more satisfying than an awful lot of the stuff that's currently on offer in the marketplace, and a lot less exhausting too.
And let me add that if you understand what you have in a neighborhood, you were mentioning, you have the resources for security and for food and for health and for raising children. If you understand that those are there, and all you have to do is to uncover them, right, is to make them visible, you'll begin to see how people respond to that idea. I recently saw a list of the gifts of people on one block, and a person who lived on that block had asked everybody, tell me your gift, and had written it up on a piece of paper and then put it in the mailbox, gave it back to everybody. And all of a sudden, there was a new sense in the neighborhood of what the possibilities were once they saw what they had that they were not using, that they were not involved in. And the thing we've learned in the last 30 years is that when you begin to connect the various threads, if you want to call them that, when we begin to see what we have and begin to connect them, we create a fabric that is strong, not programs that are single threads. That doesn't build real strength. And so the book is trying also to say there are certain kinds of functions that can only be done at the neighborhood level. And if you're not connected, they won't get done, and your life won't be a very good life. So this is, in that sense, a guide to the good life by saying, if you know what is here and you get it connected, you will be greatly enhancing your life, your family life, your children's life, and at the same time, enhancing the relationships of everybody to each other. It is an inspiring and engaging kind of thing. And so we don't have to be hesitant or fearful. The answer is, and we know this thousands of times, that right in your neighborhood, in the houses on either side of you, are people who have gifts and talents and skills and passions and knowledge that they're willing to share. But nothing happens if somebody or buddies doesn't begin the process by asking, what do you have to offer? And once it's put it that way, people will really respond, right? Because you're talking to the best of themselves as they see themselves, that you're building on something that I value. And as when I express it, I begin to feel much more powerful, much more connected, and much less lonely, much more productive.
And just on that lonely piece as well, John and Heather, it strikes me that loneliness has a twin, and the twin is a feeling of uselessness.
Yeah.
I am not for anybody. I am needy. Why do I go to work? Because I need money. Why do I go to college? Because I need to learn such and such a thing so I can go and I can get a job and then I can make money. But, you know, but in the neighborhood, you're not needy, you're needed. And this is the key point. In a neighborhood, and to be neighborly, you need to be needed. And you need to recognize that you're needed. This is a key thing over and over again. The people who are showing up and contributing at a neighborhood level are recognizing that they are useful, that they do have a contribution. And the beautiful message really is that everybody has a contribution. There is nobody that is not needed. And that's the great, I think, statement of equality. Around here, everybody is in. Everybody's contribution, and of course that will be very diverse, but everybody's contribution matters at every age, from womb to tomb. Everybody is needed.
And that's especially hard to recognize with people who you give all kinds of names to: marginal, at the edge, mental problems, etc., etc. And we're not talking just about people who would be thought to be normal. What we mean by a thriving and useful neighborhood is that we're putting together all of our building blocks in ways that make some building blocks from people who drink too much, some building blocks from people who have no money, some building blocks where, and I hate to say this, some building blocks where there's domestic abuse going on. But if we understood that that person or people had gifts, right, we could begin to pull them away from the behavior that we all agree is not good behavior. It's very, very useful too.
It is. And then I'm going to bring some practicality into this conversation because I'm looking also at the questions. I'm doing this in my own community, and I was talking to John about the getting to know fear. Fear plays a real big role in this connection and disconnection. I'm fearful of saying the wrong thing. I'm fearful of somebody shutting the door on my face, rejection. So fear does play in here. And Cormac, you talked about that and that sense of feeling needy. And one of the questions about rural community, and I'm in a rural community, is you have to just think of it in a different way. So I'm not good at knocking on doors by myself independently. However, I am really good when I'm buying my milk and I chat with the cashier in line or the person in front of me and ask questions. So it's not a prescription. And John, I quote this all the time: when you've seen one community, you've only seen one community. And so these are ideas that you need to mull over and think, and what would work in my community? If I don't have sidewalks, I don't have bumping places, but you know what? We have Corn Fest here. Right? So where are the places that people are meeting that you can have conversations and talking with? And then eventually it's building up my confidence that I might be able to drive to my neighbors because I'm on concessions to go and do that. So it's do you have to start up at the moon in the sky? No, you can start with the ground and the worms and play around with it. So I'm hoping that it's an anonymous attendee kind of touched upon that question. But I want to take us to the next question, because you talked about everybody contributes. That's what I love about asset-based community development and this book is we talk about equity, diversity, inclusion. It's a key part of all the community work we do. It's a big focus in Canada. So, and John, you talked about inside out. So can you tell us what you mean in the book about inside out, and how will this contribute? How does this, and working this way, contribute to a more equitable, diverse, included community?
Okay, John, do you want to pitch
Are
in
you
first?
asking me? You've got to start with the premise that a neighborhood that is strong uses the talents of everybody. And everybody, each person who isn't involved, makes the community weaker. Let me say it again. Each person whose gifts are trapped in a house, it makes the neighborhood weaker. The strongest the neighborhood can be is if everybody in that neighborhood is in some way contributing what they have, not what we want them to do, but what they have that they believe is of value. So that at least is the way I would start that. Cormac?
Beautiful. Yeah. So one of the things that's really, for me, it's quite alive at the moment when I think about EDI is I think sometimes it's about everyday inclusion. In the everydayness of our lives, when we're trying to figure out what might we do together to bring people who are traditionally pushed to the edge, to the center, not out of charity, not out of sympathy, but because we can't live a good life without them. This really is that deep recognition. We are interdependent. So it's not about setting up, I'm a really good person. And I've discovered that there's people here who don't have enough to eat. So I'm going to set up a system whereby I can be Madam Bountiful and I can get a big long line of needy neighbors and I can feel good at the top of that line and I can feed them. That's not what we're talking about. That's not inclusion. Mm-hmm. Inclusion is when I am prepared to do community with my neighbors. And all means all. And that means with their fallibility, with their fragility, and with my own vulnerability too. That recognition that our liberation, our joy, our possibility, our potential, and our planet are all down to how interdependent we are. So that idea that John was talking about, that we live our lives braided together in a world that says that we are rugged individuals and we're on our own. That story of the rugged individual breaks our hearts or makes us hard-hearted or cold-hearted just to get by. And one of the ways we cope is we numb out, we dissociate. So all of the potential empathy that we have starts to feel like I've only got to know that I've only got a bank of empathy for my friends, for my family, just to get through the day. But what we find is when we do the community organizing work in our neighborhoods, it starts to enable people to tap into that empathy again and to really move beyond projects and beyond sympathy into really what might it be like here if everybody really got the opportunity to take the label off and to be recognized for their gifts. And what we're finding, this isn't, by the way, a theory. What we're reporting to you is what you know too, and what many of the people on the call know. That when we actually do things, now cultures, I'm not always convinced that culture is about values or beliefs. I think you create culture through action. So when we do things together, we say, hey, something needs doing. And we get past opinions that polarize us. And we actually start taking on projects in our local place. I think it's really, really interesting to ask ourselves, how much equity do people have? So I think, for example, in the Diamond neighborhoods in San Diego, where they recognized their issue was one around having a food desert in those neighborhoods. But the way they dealt with that was equity. You asked about equity. Well, now they own their own supermarket. So they didn't set up food pantries. They went to have equity. So now when, you know, a child in a car driving by with his dad or mum looks at that supermarket, they can say, Mum, Dad, do I own that? And the answer is yes. That's equity. That diversity in that particular, you know, supermarket I'm thinking of, every single ethnic group in those neighborhoods has, with their own hands and their own sweat and their own inventiveness and their own money, even though they didn't have much of it, have invested in that together so that they could respond and create greater food sovereignty. That's real inclusion. Mm-hmm. And one of my great concerns is sometimes what we say when we say equity, diversity, and inclusion is we mean everybody gets the same access to the same program as long as they're prepared to be a client. What we're talking about is fundamentally about being a citizen in a democracy where you're not just defined as needy, but you're needed. That's real EDI.
Yeah.
Can I also mention that for the Canadians here, that in Prince George, in British Columbia, there's a group of people called Project Friendship. And they are not a big group, but a very influential group. And they have taken on the task of making sure that there's nobody who's an outsider. Prince George has grown very big, and friendships have become lost or not created. And so they have created a group who gets to know people who are at the edge, get to know their gifts, and then connect them to maybe a club, maybe a group, maybe association, maybe another person. And they've been doing this for 30 years. You might look at their website. It's called Project Friendship. But the thing, and most of these people are people who would have a label called disability. But what you can learn from them is how many people they have engaged who are titled disabled, which has to do with their deficiency, who they found the reverse, the enabled, and used that gift as the way they reconnected people into community life. So there's a real practical example. And at least at the beginning, there are 6 people, but 6 people could connect hundreds of people in Prince George. And it's still going on.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing, and this is going to lead into the next question, is, you know, John, you talked about when you label someone, you make them invisible. That's not an EDI way of being in community and doing community work. And what I'm hearing both of you saying is that there needs to be a shift in the way we are thinking. And in the book, you talk about mindsets, and you mention them throughout the book. And I'm going to actually ask the audience. So in the chat box, what mindsets do you think that needs to happen in your community to so that it can be more connected? But to you, John and Cormac, pick your favorite mindset from the book, and explain why it's your favorite. And I'm going to ask you first, Cormac.
Would it be helpful if I just whistled through the various mindsets that we mentioned in the book, just for those who maybe haven't read the book, and I'll try and see if I can do it quickly.
That's brilliant.
Oh, good. I didn't. Good. Okay, so one of the mindsets, these are just shifts, really. One shift is a shift from looking to external resources in the marketplace So that shift is from external to internal, which is to look first at what you have locally. Okay, so that's one shift. So from outside in to inside out. The second one is a shift from deficit to asset-based mapping. So it basically says, reject the map that starts with a half empty part of the glass to the exclusion of what you have, and be intentional about really starting with what's strong. Okay, so that's another. The third one, these go by chapters as well, so there's a little bit of a kind of a rhythm to them, if you like. The other one is just about, again, it's about sourcing locally, which is a principle I think lots of people would be familiar with. So we can buy the pasteurized honey for sure, and we can also create a beehive. So, and we can source locally. So that's another example. And I'll give one more. There's about 10 of them, but I think 4 is about enough, really. And then one more is over-reliance on leaders to the exclusion, or maybe not to, not seeing the great value in what we call connectors, right? So there's some options that people might want to give some thought to. There's others, but there's 4.
Mm-hmm.
And another mindset, I'm sure it's in the rest of the list, but that occurs to me is the idea of scarcity as against abundance. And that when I look now, after all these years, at a neighborhood, what I see is a treasure chest. It's full of all kinds of jewels, pearls, and what doesn't happen is it doesn't get opened too often. But when you get open, there is in every neighborhood just a proliferation of possibilities. I think, Heather, in another setting, there's a in a town in Wisconsin called the Menasha. I'm sorry, not Menasha, the town, I'm mixing these towns up. It's Kansas City. A little group associated with a church in a neighborhood got 20 kids under 13 to spend some of the summer going and getting to know the neighbors and finding out specifically what kind of talents and gifts and abilities they have. And 20 kids under 13 found 60 gifts among the people in the immediate neighborhood around this particular church. 60, all unused. Now, if you get a mindset that says, good heavens, I'm sitting here in the middle of a place, and right at the center next to me is a treasure chest. and if I got at the business of seeing this place as a treasure chest rather than a bunch of troubled people, I'd be on the way to not having a bunch of troubled people. Let me put it that way.
And in the chat box, there's talking about a shift from judgment to curiosity.
Yes,
it's one of the ones that.
Yeah. There's one of the things we wanted to do, Heather, in, I suppose, thinking about mindset shifts, is just to encourage people to recognize it. Some of how we view ourselves and how we view our neighbors and how we view our places can be really quite fundamentally positive. There's no question. And even just starting with what you have and using that to begin the process of building a better life for yourself is a really good way to do. So one of the kind of key things is to recognize that the building blocks don't all come made the same way. So there can be very primary building blocks, which are local and within community influence. And, you know, somebody mentioned in the chat a question around, well, I live in a rural area, there's no even basic footpaths. So, you know, in terms of connecting with my neighbors, it's a really hard thing to do. And certainly ABCD is not a replacement for, you know, it's not a cure-all or a fix for issues like that, where there's basic issues of infrastructure that need to be addressed. So, you know, we're not for a minute saying that primary assets, things that are local and within your control, can fix all known problems. What we're saying is there's also secondary assets. There are things that are local, but maybe are not within your control. How many people listening on the call live in communities where schools that are in their local neighborhood, that could be community centers, could be education centers at night, could be, you know, pea patch garden venues, you know, in terms of using their green space, but they're not. They're shut 6 months of the year. And after 4 p.m. in the evening, they're closed, right? Well, that's an example of a secondary asset. Yes, it's local, but for all intents and purposes, it's a silo. It only does one thing. It's like the library that only lends books, as opposed to, you know, has affordable apartments on top on the second story or whatever. Now, then there's external assets, and external assets are neither local nor within community influence or control right now, like funding, for example, state funding or federal funding, right? They are all important assets. Now, the question is, what kind of state of mind do I want to adopt if I want to be resourceful along with my neighbors? We are uncredentialed people, right? For the most part. We're not walking around with titles. We're just trying to make the best of where we live and what we do together, right? Well, what we're saying in the book is, if you want to build your power and build your sense of resourcefulness, start with the primary assets. Start with those assets that are within your control locally and begin to tap into those. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to accept second best, but here's the funny thing. Once you do that, it becomes a whole lot easier to sit down with the school principal and say, hey, let us tell you some stories about what we've been doing. And we'd love you to get involved. In fact, better yet, have your kids, the pupils in the school, do that, as they talk to other people outside of the school and do maybe an oral history project together. And then you open up a new set of conversations and a new set of possibilities. And then when you sit with a donor, you're not saying, hey, Mr. Donor, will you please give us some money to do a project? You're saying, this train's left the station. We're going to audition you to see whether or not you could be a co-investor with us. We're the primary investors around here, and we would love you to be a useful outsider that can come along and help. And hey, it'll be good for you too. And I think you'll enjoy it. Now, that's the mindset that we're advocating. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that outside agencies need to do. Of course there are. But what we're saying is, as we build that sense of agency, resourcefulness, and abundance, what you end up with is a much stronger seat at the table when you do need to sit down and negotiate. And you're also in a much better position to deal with folks that are externally doing you over, because it's much easier to organize when everybody is participating, not just to solve problems, but also people see themselves as, we're producers around here. We have a way, we have a culture, and it matters. So I think they're the mindsets in a nutshell, I think we're trying to convey.
So I'm going to ditch my questions to you, because we've got some coming in, and I want to actually focus on some of the questions on students, but I'm going to talk about youth, because youth are students. You're, you know, from the time you start elementary school all the way up to university, and we have 15 students on the call here. And one of the comments was about adding an E to ABCDE, which is education, and how does education play in this? But also, this is something that I'm seeing in my rural community. As somebody who wasn't born and raised in this community, I was an outsider and had to really work hard to be part of my community. Can you imagine? And I'm an adult, and I could host, like, I could talk with people, but can you imagine a student moving into a new place, starting university in a community, and dealing with this outsider, this I've lived here, you're transient, you're not going to be here. So Any thoughts or comments on, youth in this journey and this whole outsider insider?
Oh, boy, that's a very important question because we think there are 7 functions that neighborhoods uniquely can perform. And one of them is the preparation or the raising of young people so that they become effective citizens. And that the key there is not to have them as outsiders, but as producers.
Mhm.
One of the best neighborhood organizations I ever met was called the Dudley Street Neighborhood. And it was a group of neighbors that literally transformed their block in a low-income neighborhood in Boston. And they insisted, as they went about the renewal process, that in every single thing that they did, there had to be young people involved. Young people had to be thought of as producers, not apprentices. They were in the group just the way everybody else was. 20 years later, I went back to Dudley Street. I've been there other times too, but I remember one time, 20 years later, where they had a staff of 3. 2 of the 3 had been kids who were 5 and 6 when I met them at the beginning of the Dudley Street Initiative, because they involved all the kids in the process. And as a result, the leadership of Dudley Street was made up, at least in terms of staffing, of the people they had started with 20 years before. I was recently at a meeting of a county board in California. And at the board meeting, there was a request for some money, a grant for a youth program. And one of the men at the meeting said, I want to say that I object to us giving that grant or anything like it. One of our big problems is we have young people who are always segregated into age groups for young people. If we said youth programs were like segregated anything, we'd say, oh, that's not good, right? So at any rate, the man was saying, we need a proposal that gets young people and adult people together. We don't need more kids with kids. And so I think the engagement in the actual productive work of a neighborhood is the way to prepare somebody for citizenship, and is the way you really get educated, by understanding real life rather than life in a book.
Mhm.
Absolutely. It's so striking, isn't it, that often young people want fundamentally to be needed. Their greatest need is the need to be needed. And so often how we're relating to them as adults is saying to them, what we're going to do as adults is we're going to convey you to places under which you will be seen as units of surveillance. So we don't allow them to go out on the streets to play with fellow neighbors who are also fellow young people anymore. We organize playdates. We dispatch them to single purpose institutions called schools, where, it's an interesting question about education, because I think one of the things is we could flip that question and say, could we also invite some of the units and some of the institutions of education to really recognize that the primary unit of education is the neighborhood, not the classroom. And the primary teacher is the citizen, of which, you know, a teacher is one. And, you know, when we think about it in those ways, we also recognize there's no age barrier to contribution in the neighborhood. So yes, it takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a child sometimes to raise a village, to raise the awareness. Just last night in Germany, we saw a child, and I don't want to start naming names, but a child who's really bringing global conscious awareness to the importance of showing up around our planet and recognizing that we shouldn't just be stewarding our planet, but we should be revering Mother Nature. We have a responsibility to Mother Nature. Again, I don't want to get pulled into a big debate about, you know, protests and all of that, but I admire her because she's not a leader of tomorrow. She's a leader of today. She's showing up. We saw this with gun control. You remember, John, when I was in Chicago a few years back, and I'm not, again, advocating one way or another about kids walking out of classroom, or I don't even want to go down. That's just a red herring. But the kids showed up. They said, hey, this is something, we stand for peace. And, you know, they're sending a message to us as adults now in every single neighborhood. The trick is not to aggregate all of the kids with each other and say, hey, kids, off you go and do something. We need to learn from gangs, because gangs have figured out something that we as communities need to know, which is this. If you can actually create a connection between young people and productive adults, and you can do something meaningfully about our shared place, that really gives them a sense that they're needed, and they actually are. So creating those kinds of connections, I think, is important. We see the growth of gangs as we see the retreat in citizenship in neighborhoods. So I think what we need to learn to recognize here is this isn't just a youth question. This is a village question.
That's, oh. So I never end on time, but I'm going to really try hard. And we had such lovely questions in. So I want to thank Avery for bringing the student, and I added in youth question there. And I want to end with Nikoma talking about organizations that have come together in their community. But I like this little piece that they wrote. It is the belief in themselves that make them powerful. I think that's a really great way to end this, is the belief in ourselves, which will make us powerful. This work is hard. And, you know, it's starting with little things. Pick a mindset out of here, pick one, work on it, think about it, adapt it, mold it to your community, and then try another one and try another one. If you jump in this and try to be a bulldozer, it's going to be hard to do this work. And I'm talking from a municipal perspective, because you've got systems and other people, but you know, change happens in slow ways, and we'll start growing and growing in the ripple effect. I'm always about what to do next. And so what and now what? A great idea from the Greenwood Coalition, and Jamie will put the link in the chat box. They're doing a community-wide read of the book. And also John and Cormac are doing other talks and book clubs and studies. I want to do a disclaimer that I'm not being paid to be promoting this book. That this book is really good, and I'm here because I believe in it, in asset-based community development. I believe that if the way we were doing it worked, we wouldn't be where we are, and the old ways will not open up new doors. New ways will open up new doors. So I really truly believe that we need to be doing these mind shifts. We need to be thinking differently and trying new things. And if you're stuck, deepening community, we are here. This is what we want to do. We want to create a national movement in doing community in a different way, putting people at the center of your plans and your activities and your programs. So reach out to us. We're here to support you. I'm over. I didn't make it, but thank you so much, John and Cormac. I feel like we might have to do a part two. We might have to do a part two. There's a lot of questions in here. Stay tuned, and we will all have a great day, and keep up the amazing work. Change happens one by one. Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks so much,
bye.
Heather. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.